Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today,
Class is in session.
today we're going to learn all about classes. We're going to learn a little bit about inheritance and just some other little fun things too. So stay tuned. Okay, we got a lot to talk about today, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and open my Java folder, and we're going to open it with Visual Studio Code. Instead of making the file name after the topic like we've normally done, let's go ahead and make our file name, and we're going to call it animal. So let's call it animal.java. And now we're going to make our class after the name that we made for our file. So we'll say class animal with our open and close curly brackets. And now let's kind of take a second before we actually make the main method and talk about what a class normally contains. So the basic structure of a class is normally going to contain a set of attributes and methods. These are the two primary things that actually create a class. Now you might be asking yourself what an attribute is. Well, simply put, an attribute is going to be a variable. So if we're thinking of an animal, we might give our animal a name. So for example, I could do string name, and we can say the name here is Fido. Now our animal can have other attributes too. For example, it could have like an integer value for the number of eyes. So we could say num eyes, and we could just put that equal to 2. We could also do another integer value for the number of legs it has. So we could say int num legs, and that can be equal to 4 in the case of a dog. And then finally, we could do something like, say, a Boolean value, and we can say something like has tail, and we could set this equal to true. So just remember, attributes are the variables that are inside of the class itself. Now, we also have methods as well, and these are going to be things like the bark method that we did in our last video. So we could do something like void bark, and then we can just simply have it do something like a system.out.println, and then just say bark. And that could be our method. So on a very basic level, this is going to be what our actual class is comprised of. It's going to be comprised of variables and methods. Now, most of this shouldn't be new to you. If you've been following along with this video series, we kind of have a really basic understanding of what variables and methods are and how we can use them. And then we also understand that the main method is a method, which we will define again in a little bit, so hang tight on that one. But let's get into a new thing. It's going to be a new type of method that we haven't talked about yet. And this is going to be what we call the constructor. So what exactly is the constructor? I like to think of the constructor as kind of like a grocery list that basically defines what the values are for a particular class. A constructor has a couple of rules. For one, you can have multiple constructors. So you can have multiple constructors. But two, the constructor has to be named after the class name. So the constructor has to be named after the class name. Another unique thing for a constructor is it doesn't require a return type. So we can actually mark that down too. It does not require a return type. Remember how when we were talking about the functions video, like for example, this bark method that we actually have up here, we have to say void bark, because if we were to just put bark, then it's going to say that there's no return type. We could actually test this out really quick. So let's go ahead and save this. And just so you can see, if I took this void off and I actually went ahead and saved this, let's go ahead and go and cd to our desktop and our Java folder. And let's just try to compile what we have so far. So we'll say javac animal.java. You're going to see that we have an error for the bark function. It's going to say invalid declaration. We need a return type. So let's actually create a constructor here so you can see what this is all about. So let's go back into here and let's make our animal constructor. So I'm going to simply just say public animal. And then we're going to open and close our parentheses with our curly brackets. And then inside of the parentheses, remember, this is where your parameters go that we learned about in the last video. Since we know that we set the attributes for Fido up here to have the name Fido, he has 2 eyes, he has 4 legs, and he also has a tail. Well, let's do a snake in this case. So this snake, we're going to pass a couple of different things. we want to make sure that we can define all of these variables here. So let's go ahead and pass a variable for each one of those. So first thing we're going to pass is a string. We're going to pass the letter N for name. And then for the number of eyes, we're going to go ahead and pass an int E for eyes. We're going to go ahead and pass another integer L for legs. And then finally, we're going to pass a Boolean HT for has tail. So in this case here, let's go ahead and think of this as we're defining each one of these variables here. And in order to do that, inside of our animal constructor, we're going to want to call each one of these variables. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to call name, and we're going to set that equal to n. We're going to call number of eyes, or num eyes, and we're going to set that equal to e. We're going to call num legs, which we're going to go ahead then and set that equal to L. And then finally, we're going to set has tail, which we're going to say is equal to HT. This constructor is going to set each one of the variables up here. Now, how are we going to use this constructor? Let's go ahead now and finally make our main method. So go ahead and say it along with me. Public static void main string array args, and let's get into it. All right, so remember in the last video how we talked about the concept of an object? So let's go ahead now and we're gonna make a snake object. So in this instance, we're gonna say animal snake is equal to new animal, open and close parentheses, with a semicolon. So this is gonna look pretty familiar to you if you followed them in the last video. But just so you understand really quickly, this snake object is being created by using the animal class, which is where this animal is coming from. But one key distinction that we actually need to make is the constructor. So by defining the constructor, what we're doing is we're saying that in order to create an animal, we need a name, we need the number of eyes, we need the legs, and we need if it has a tail or not. If I were to try to run this right now, what do you think will happen? Let's go ahead and run it and find out. So I'm going to go ahead and compile, and I get an error. So first it says that I've got an error that I don't have a return type. We never fixed that, so that's not new. Let's go ahead and fix that really quick. If I go to Bark and I put void and save this again, let's try to run this again and see if we have another error. And we actually do have another error. It actually says here that we created a new animal, but look at what the error says. The error says the constructor animal in class animal cannot be applied to the given types. We passed nothing, but what it expected was a string, 2 integer values, and a Boolean. How does it expect that? Because if we look at our constructor here, we have a string, 2 integer values, and a Boolean. Because we define this, we need to make sure that's what we give it. For our snake, we're going to go ahead and call our snake Ekans. And then Ekans has 2 eyes, so we're just going to pass the number 2. But Ekans doesn't have any legs, so we're going to say 0 for the number of legs. And finally, we're going to get to the tail, which we're going to say his body is 1 giant tail. So we'll go ahead and say true for this one. And now we can say that our snake has the name Ekans. It has 2 eyes. It has 0 legs, and it does have a tail. So if we were to compile this, is this still going to result in an error? Let's find out. So if I go compile, no error. But if I try to run this at the moment, so if I put Java animal, you'll notice that nothing happens. And that's because we didn't do anything. So let's kind of toy around with this object that we have here again. And let's see if we can get it to print out the values for its attributes. So we're going to go ahead now and just simply do something like a simple system.out.println. And then we're going to do snake.name. And let's see if that prints out. So let's go ahead and put our semicolon here. Save this. And let's go ahead and run. So by compile, run. And now you can see we have Ekans. Kind of like what we did before. But this one was a little bit more complex because we actually defined a constructor here. Now, we could do this for all the other attributes, and just to drive the point home, let's go ahead and print out everything else. So we'll do 3 more print statements, and then instead of just name, we're going to do number of eyes, we're going to do number of legs, and then we're going to do has tail. So let's print all of these. So I'm going to save. Let's go ahead and compile. And let's go ahead and run. And you can see we have Ekin's attributes right here. We have Ekin's 2 eyes, no legs, and it does have a tail. That's the basics of a constructor. Now you might also have a question about, can you have multiple constructors? And the answer is yes. So if I wanted to set up a second constructor that didn't take any arguments inside of its parentheses here, I'm allowed to do that. So let's go ahead and do one more constructor just to show that. So I'm going to copy this. Let's go ahead and paste it and then fix our spacing. And let's pass no variables here. We're going to call this an empty constructor. So let's go ahead and move this up. And now we just have an empty constructor. If we wanted to use this and then we wanted to actually keep the dog, we could now call this constructor and we would have all of our dog attributes here. So let's go ahead now and just make a quick animal here. And we're going to call this dog equals new animal, open and close parentheses with nothing inside of it. Now remember, the reason why I'm putting nothing between these parentheses here is because I want to use this constructor to make my object. So by putting nothing here, I'm saying explicitly to Java, hey, use this constructor. Don't use this constructor when you're making the dog. So let's test this out now. Let's get rid of the snake.name stuff and let's just replace it with dog really quick. So if I put dog here, here, and then in the final 2 spots, here and here, what do you think is going to print out? Is it going to be Ekin's 2, 0 and true? Or is it going to be Fido and all of his attributes? Let's find out. So let's save this and let's go ahead and compile and run. And we got Fido's attributes this time. So that's just going to show you that you can use multiple constructors if you would like to. Now that we have that set up, and let's make sure that we mark this down just so that we know that we use 2 different constructors. So I'm going to call this constructor 2, and then we'll just say that this is the empty constructor. Okay. So now that we understand the basics of how a constructor works and what the basics of a class is, let's now talk about inheritance. So if we look, see how I have a snake here and we have our snake called Ekin's? Well, Ekin's actually has access to a function that we made up here called bark. And just to show you what I could do now, let's get rid of these print statements and let's make Ekin's bark by saying snake.bark. Snake.bark. And save this. Let's go ahead now and compile and run it. Compile. And I got an error. So we can see here that it says void is not allowed here. I actually made a mistake. And that's okay. It's a really easy fix. So see how I actually tried to do a system.out.print line here? And I called my function right here? Well, it turns out that this print statement doesn't allow a void type. So all I have to do to fix this is just simply say snake.bark instead of system.out.println snake.bark. So now by doing this, it should run. So let's go ahead now and just recompile. We have no errors. And now let's go ahead and run this. And you can see I was able to make Ekin's bark just like that. But we all agree that snakes don't bark, right? I think it's kind of funny to think of a snake barking, but let's fix this with what we call inheritance. The first major change that we're going to make to this is we're going to make a dog class. So let's go right below the animal class. So we're going to go down to line 32 and we're going to define a class called dog. Now inside of this class, we're going to go ahead and copy this bark function over. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this out. And then we're just going to put this bark function right inside of the dog class. And let's make sure everything lines up properly. It's always important to make sure that everything is lined up properly. It'll set you up to do things really well. Okay, so now that we have this dog class, let's talk about how inheritance works in a real world perspective. So in the real world, when you have an animal, a particular subclass of animal would be a dog, right? Because you think of a dog as a type of animal, just like you think a snake as a type of animal, which is why some of these attributes will make sense for Fido, but it's not going to make sense for Ekans. Like, for example, bark isn't going to make sense for Ekans, but also number of legs is also not going to really make sense for a snake either, which is why we could just simply put the number 0. Another thing we can do is make our dog class inherit from the class animal. How do we do that? Just like so. So in our dog class, we're going to make it say extends animal. Now, what is this doing here? What does this extends animal mean? Well, all it means is the dog class is going to contain all of the attributes of animal and any functions that it might have as well. So since we know that our dog is going to have a name, number of eyes, number of legs, and if it has a tail or not. So all the dog class here is doing is adding the method bark. Instead of calling our dog an animal, let's call it a dog directly. So let's go ahead now and say dog. And then we're going to define it over here as well as dog. Now remember, I didn't set a constructor for my dog here, so I don't have to pass any attributes. But also, since I didn't create a constructor for my dog, it's going to have all of the basic attributes for the animal class. So we're going to see the name Fido, the number of eyes, and the number of legs all be the same as what you see up here. The only difference is we're going to have access to this method here. So remember how we made our snake bark before? Well, let's save this and let's actually try to run it and see what happens. So let's see if the snake can still bark. We're going to compile, and sure enough, we get snake.bark, error, it cannot find the symbol, the method bark. So the method bark no longer exists in the animal type because it's now in the dog type. If I were to now try it with the dog instead, so let's go ahead now and say dog.bark and save and run this. So let's go ahead and compile. So we got no error, and now let's run it. You can see that we were able to make the dog bark. So remember, we defined the dog here, and then we called dog.bark. But that's not very impressive, and that doesn't fully show what inheritance is all about. So now let's actually show the dog's name and everything else that comes with the dog. So we're going to go ahead and do a system.out.println, and then we're going to go ahead and print the dog's name. So we're going to say dog.name. And let's go ahead and print out the dog's other attributes too. So let's go ahead and copy this. And let's go ahead and paste this now. So we're going to do 4, so that way we get all attributes. And let's do the eyes. So we're going to say num eyes. Then we're going to do num legs. And then we're going to do has tail. So now what we should see is the dog should be able to bark from the dog class, but it should also be able to get its attributes from its parent class, which is up here. So let's run this and see what happens. Compile and run. And we got bark, the name Fido, 2 eyes, 4 legs, and Fido indeed has a tail. So let's kind of recap. There was a lot in there, so let's just go over really briefly what we talked about, and we'll wrap things up. So first, a class consists of attributes, which are variables within the class, and methods, which you can see down here in this class as well. And also, to answer the question, if you were thinking about it, you can absolutely have more than one class inside of a file. Now, of those attributes and methods, you can set things up with a constructor. Remember, you can have multiple constructors, but there's also a couple rules for constructors. Constructors have to be named after the class name that it's in. Constructors also do not require a return type. It's a special type of method that just simply sets up the class. And we were able to kind of see how that works with the snake object that we created here. And then finally, we talked about how inheritance works, because remember, a dog is a type of animal, so a dog extends animal. An animal is the parent class, where dog is the child class. So dog is able to get access to this cool method bark, where a snake can no longer get access to bark like what we did before. So by defining a dog here, we were able to make the dog bark, and then we were also able to print out its attributes from its parent class. Now, this is a very difficult subject to wrap your head around, and believe me, it took me a long time to understand it too. So if you need to, rewatch this video. If you have questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and kick this to Dino in the future. I guess you could say that class is no longer in session. Honestly, classes, inheritance, and constructors is something that I really struggled with when I was first learning this stuff. So if you need to watch this video again, please feel free to do so. I hope that I could help you. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below. But other than that, I am DB, you are you. Let's keep rocking. And let's keep learning. My eyes are spinning. I told myself I wouldn't do that anymore, but I did. But anyway, peace out.